The sun hadn't fully risen over Silver Pine Lake yet, but the water already shimmered with soft gold light. Mist curled off the surface like breath in cold air. Birds called from the trees along the shore. Herons, kingfishers, the occasional loon. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a secret. Out on the water, a small wooden boat cut through the glassy surface. It wasn't fancy, just an old skiff lovingly kept with peeling green paint and a single oar resting across the gunnels. At the stern sat a man in his late 40s, wearing a faded flannel shirt and a baseball cap pulled low. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he belonged to the rhythm of the lake itself. His name was Darnell, though most folks in the neighborhood didn't know that. To them, he was just that guy who lived in the little cabin on the far side of the lake, the one hidden behind the pines, barely visible from the road. Some thought he was a caretaker. Others assumed he was renting. No one ever asked, and no one ever imagined he owned the whole thing. Darnell had been coming out here since he was 6 years old. His grandfather bought the land back in 1952, when banks wouldn't lend money to black men in this part of the state. He paid cash, every last dollar saved from running a repair shop in town, and walked the property line himself with a surveyor's chain and a notebook. He built the cabin by hand, planted the pines, and taught his grandson how to read the water like a map. Now, decades later, Darnell still followed those lessons. He knew where the bass liked to hide in spring, when the bluegill would spawn near the reeds, and how to tell if the lake was healthy just by the way the light hit the surface. He didn't fish for sport. He fished to eat, and sometimes he just came out to sit, to remember, but that peace wouldn't last long this morning. As he guided the boat toward the main dock, the one built by the Homeowners Association in the 90s, he saw a figure waiting, a woman in crisp linen pants and a silk blouse, arms crossed, standing like she owned the place. Which in her mind she kind of did. Linda Choate had lived in Silver Pine for 12 years. She'd been HOA president for 5. She organized the holiday boat parade, enforced the rules about mailbox colors, and once got a neighbor fined for leaving their kayak on the lawn for more than 24 hours. She believed in order, in standards, in knowing your place, and right now she was convinced this man in the old boat was in the wrong one. "Excuse me," she called out, voice sharp enough to scatter the birds. Darnell slowed the boat, letting it drift the last few feet to the dock. He didn't say anything, just waited. "That boat," Linda said, pointing. "It's not supposed to be moored here. Section 4, subsection B of the HOA covenants clearly states that only approved watercraft may be docked at community piers, and that," she wrinkled her nose slightly, "doesn't look approved." Darnell stepped onto the dock, tying the rope with a simple knot his grandfather taught him. "I wasn't mooring it," he said calmly. "Just tying up for a minute." "Well, you can't," she said. "This is a shared space. We have aesthetics to maintain. People pay good money to live here. We can't have eyesores." He looked at her then, not with anger, but with a quiet kind of weariness. "Ma'am," he said, "this lake belongs to my family. Has for over 70 years. Linda let out a short laugh like he'd told a joke. "Oh, honey, I think you're confused. The lake is part of the Silver Pine community. It's managed by the HOA, everyone knows that." "I'm not confused," Darnell said gently. "My grandfather bought this land outright. The deed includes the lake bed, the shoreline, everything within the original 200-acre parcel." She blinked, then shook her head. "That's impossible. The developer purchased all the land in the 80s. There's no private ownership on the lake." "Not all of it," Darnell said. "Just this part. The rest was sold off later." "Ours wasn't." Linda's expression hardened. She wasn't used to being contradicted, especially not by someone she'd already decided didn't belong. "Listen," she said, stepping closer. "I don't know what story you've been told, but you need to move that boat today. If it's still here tomorrow, we'll start charging fines. And if you keep ignoring the rules, we'll have no choice but to involve legal counsel." Darnell didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly like he'd heard this kind of thing before. Maybe he had. "All right," he said. "I hear you." He untied the boat, pushed off, and rowed back toward his side of the lake without another word. Linda watched him go, satisfied. She pulled out her phone and typed a quick message to the HOA board. "Trespasser issue at main dock. Boat removed, but we need to enforce rules more strictly. Recommend posting new signage." She didn't see the way Darnell glanced back once just before the trees swallowed his boat from view. She didn't know he'd grown up hearing stories about people who showed up at his grandfather's gate with papers and threats, claiming the land couldn't possibly be his. She didn't realize that for men like Darnell, being told you don't belong here wasn't new. It was history repeating itself. Back at his cabin, Darnell poured a cup of coffee and sat on the porch. The lake stretched out before him, calm again. He thought about calling his lawyer, thought about digging out the deed from the fireproof box in the closet, thought about how easy it would be to just stay quiet, move his boat farther away, avoid trouble. But then he remembered his grandfather's voice. Land ain't just dirt, boy. It's memory. It's proof. You let folks forget who owns it, they'll start acting like they own you. He sipped his coffee. The sun climbed higher. Somewhere across the water, a lawnmower started up. Life in Silver Pine went on, unaware that everything was about to change. Darnell didn't want to fight, but he wasn't going to disappear either. Not this time. By noon, the story had already spread through Silver Pine like a summer wildfire. Linda hadn't just sent a message to the HOA board. She'd mentioned it at the coffee shop, dropped a comment at the mailbox cluster, and even told the guy who trimmed her hedges. By lunchtime, half the neighborhood believed a stranger was squatting on the lake, living out of a rotting boat and blocking access to their fishing spot. At the monthly HOA meeting that evening, the room buzzed with nervous energy. Folding chairs were packed tight in the community clubhouse, usually reserved for potlucks and holiday decorating contests. Tonight it felt more like a town hall on edge. Linda stood at the front, laser pointer in hand, projecting a blurry photo of Darnell's boat onto a white sheet tacked to the wall. "This," she said firmly, "is a clear violation of our covenants. Not only is the vessel unregistered and unsightly, but the individual refuses to identify himself or comply with basic community standards." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. One man raised his hand. "Is he even supposed to be here? I thought the lake was off limits to outsiders." "That's what we're trying to determine," Linda replied. "But until we do, we must protect our property values and shared spaces." In the back corner near the door, an older man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses shifted in his seat. His name was Miguel, and he'd lived in Silver Pine longer than most, since before the golf cart paths and the strict rules about holiday lights. He remembered when the lake was just woods and water, before the developers carved it into neat parcels with names like Cedar Cove and Willow Bend. He also remembered something else, an old map his late wife had framed for him years ago, showing land tracts from the 1950s. One parcel, shaded in light green, was labeled Whitmore 200 acres. He'd always assumed the family had sold it, but now he wasn't so sure. After the meeting, Miguel lingered as people filed out. He caught Linda near the snack table. "You said this man won't identify himself?" he asked. "He gave a name," she said, flipping through her notes. "Darnell something. Whitmore, I think." Miguel froze. "Whitmore?" "Yes, why?" He didn't answer right away, just nodded slowly like a puzzle piece had clicked into place. "Nothing. Just odd name. Haven't heard it around here." But he knew better. He'd heard it, once long ago, from a county clerk who mentioned a black landowner who'd held on to his property through redlining, threats, and decades of pressure to sell. Most folks assumed the land had changed hands, but maybe it hadn't. Meanwhile, Darnell sat at his kitchen table, the deed spread out before him under a single lamp. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the ink slightly faded, but the words were clear, including all waterways, submerged lands, and natural resources contained within the described boundaries. Signed, notarized, recorded in 1952, and never transferred. He'd gone to the county courthouse that afternoon just to be sure. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, had pulled the file without hesitation. "Oh, the Whitmore tract," she'd said. "Still active. Still in the family." She'd even smiled. "Your granddaddy was a smart man. Held on to what mattered." Now, Darnell traced his finger over his grandfather's signature. Elijah Whitmore hadn't just bought land, he'd built a legacy. One that included clean water, quiet mornings, and the right to exist without explanation. The next morning, Darnell dressed in clean jeans and a button-down shirt, nothing fancy but respectful, and drove into town. He met with a local attorney named Diane, whose office was above the hardware store. She'd grown up fishing in these waters too, though on the other side of the lake. She listened without interrupting, then asked to see the deed. After reading it, she leaned back in her chair. "You're on solid ground," she said. "Legally, emotionally, historically. They can't claim ownership just because they've used it for years. That's not how it works." "I don't want to hurt anyone," Darnell said, "but I can't let them act like this land doesn't belong to my family." "You don't have to," she replied. "But you do need to make your position clear, officially." By the end of the week, a certified letter arrived at the HOA mailbox. It stated in plain language that Darnell Whitmore was the legal owner of Whitmore Lake and surrounding acreage, as verified by county records. It further noted that the main dock, built without permission on his shoreline, was technically a trespass. The letter didn't threaten. It simply informed. Linda read it twice, then crumpled it in her fist. "This is ridiculous," she told the board the next day. "It's a technicality. People have been using that lake for 30 years. We've paid for maintenance, stocked fish, held events. That gives us rights." "Adverse possession doesn't apply here," one board member said hesitantly. "You have to occupy openly and continuously for 20 years against the owner's wishes." "But if the owner never objected, he never showed up," Linda snapped. "How were we supposed to know?" The room fell quiet. Because the truth was, no one had ever asked. No one had checked the records. They'd just assumed. Because the cabin was small, because Darnell kept to himself. Because he didn't fit the picture of who should own a lake in a place like Silverpine. That weekend, a group of fishing club members gathered at the dock anyway, as they always did on Saturdays. They launched their base boats, laughing and swapping stories, acting like nothing had changed. But this time, taped to the dock post was a new sign. Simple black letters on white plastic. Private property. Whitmore Lacano trespassing without permission, violators subject to prosecution. One of the men scoffed. "He's bluffing. This is our lake," but another hesitated. What if he's not? Back at his cabin, Darnell watched through binoculars, not with anger but with sorrow. He remembered fishing with his grandfather right where those boats now idled. He remembered the smell of pine needles and wet earth, the sound of frogs at dusk. This wasn't about keeping people out. It was about being seen. Later that evening, Miguel knocked on Darnell's door. He held a manila folder. "I found this in my attic," he said. "Old property survey. Thought you might want to see it." Darnell invited him in. They sat on the porch as fireflies blinked in the trees. "I'm sorry," Miguel said after a long pause. "We should have known. Should have asked." Darnell nodded. "People see what they expect to see." Miguel looked out at the water. "What happens now?" "I don't want enemies," Darnell said. "But I won't disappear so folks can feel comfortable." Miguel was quiet for a moment. Then, "There are folks here who'd listen. If you gave them a chance." Darnell sipped his tea. "Maybe." That night, as the moon rose over the lake, Darnell made a decision. He wouldn't fight with anger, but he wouldn't stay silent either. The next morning, he called Diane again. "I'm ready," he said. And just like that, the quiet man on the lake stopped being invisible. He knew sign on the dock didn't just stop boats, it stopped conversations. For days, no one launched from the main pier. The fishing club's usual Saturday morning gathering vanished. Instead, people stood at the edge of their yards, staring across the water like they'd lost something they never really owned. But silence never lasts long in a neighborhood built on gossip. Linda wasn't about to let this go. She called a special HOA emergency meeting and sent out an email with the subject line, "Our lake is under threat." She framed it as a battle for community rights, not property lines. "This isn't just about fishing," she told the group gathered in the clubhouse. "It's about fairness. Generational use matters. We've cared for that lake for decades." A few nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. One woman whispered to her neighbor, "But what if he really does own it?" "He can't," Linda insisted. "Not all of it. Not legally." She even reached out to a local news station. When the reporter showed up with a camera, Linda stood on the dock in a crisp blouse, gesturing toward the water. "For over 30 years, families have fished here, taught their kids to swim here, celebrated here. Now one person is trying to shut it all down. For what? Pride? Profit?" The reporter asked if they'd verified ownership. "We're looking into it," Linda said smoothly. "But common sense says a lake this size can't belong to one man." What she didn't say was that she'd already checked the county records herself and seen the truth. But admitting that would mean admitting she'd been wrong. And in her world, that wasn't an option. Meanwhile, Darnell stayed quiet. He didn't give interviews, didn't post online. He just kept doing what he'd always done, checking water levels, clearing fallen branches, watching the herons return to their nests. But now, he also met weekly with his lawyer, filing formal notices and updating land registry documents. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He was trying to be clear. Then came the day the sheriff's deputies showed up. 2 of them walked down the path to the main dock, not in a hurry, just calm and professional. A small crowd had gathered, curious neighbors, a few fishing club members holding rods like they were ready to prove a point. One deputy cleared his throat. "We've been asked to inform the Silver Pine Fishing Club that, as of today, this dock and the surrounding shoreline are private property. Continued use without the owner's permission constitutes trespassing." A murmur went through the group. "But we've been here forever," someone called out. "Doesn't change the law," the deputy said gently. "If Mr. Whitmore grants you access, that's his choice. But until then, you'll need to find another place to fish." Linda stepped forward, face tight. "This is outrageous. We'll take this to court." "You can," the deputy said, "but the deed's clear. County confirmed it twice." That night, Darnell sat on his porch again, listening to the frogs. He wasn't celebrating. He felt heavy, like he'd just closed a door he never wanted to shut. He remembered teaching a neighbor's kid how to cast a line 5 years ago. Just a quiet afternoon, no cameras, no rules. He missed that kind of connection. The next morning, he made a decision. He printed a simple flyer, not fancy, just clean text on plain paper, and walked it over to Miguel's house. "Can you help me get this to folks who might actually listen?" he asked. Miguel read it. It said, "Whitmore Lake Stewardship Notice. The lake remains private property. However, respectful individuals may apply for seasonal access permits. Requirements: no motors over 10 horsepower, catch and release only for bass. No littering or shoreline alterations. $25 annual fee. Goes toward lake cleanup and fish habitat. Contact D. Whitmore, Box 42. Silver Pine Post Office." Miguel looked up, surprised. "You're opening it back up?" "Not like before," Darnell said. "But I don't want to be the villain in their story. I just want respect." Miguel smiled faintly. "That's more than most would offer." Word spread, this time slower, quieter. A retired school teacher applied. A young couple who'd just moved in and loved kayaking asked for a permit. Even the guy who ran the local bait shop said he'd follow the rules if it meant keeping the lake healthy. But the fishing club refused. "Permits?" One member scoffed. "We're not paying rent to fish in our own backyard." Linda doubled down. She started a petition. "Save our lake, demand fair access." She got 50 signatures in 2 days. But when she tried to submit it to the county, the clerk just shook her head. "Ma'am, we can't override a legal deed. This is a civil matter between private parties." Undeterred, Linda called a neighborhood rally. She stood on a folding chair in the clubhouse parking lot, voice trembling with conviction. "They're trying to erase our history. This lake is part of who we are." But fewer people showed up than she expected. Some had already accepted permits. Others were tired of the drama. And a few, like the woman who used to watch Darnell row at dawn, had started to wonder if they'd been wrong all along. That same evening, as Darnell checked his mailbox, he found a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "My grandson loves fishing. He's 8. He doesn't know any of this mess. If there's any way he could still learn on that lake, with me watching, following all your rules, I'd be grateful." No petition, no fight. Just a boy and a rod. He read it 3 times. Then he walked inside, sat at his kitchen table, and thought about his own grandfather teaching him to tie a knot, to read the water, to treat the land like family. The next day, he wrote back. Just 2 lines on a postcard, bring him Saturday morning. 7 a.m. docks quiet then. Teach him to respect the water, and he's always welcome. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. By week's end, the sheriff's office sent a final notice. All unauthorized structures on the shoreline, like the fishing club's storage shed and bait table, had to be removed within 10 days. The club held a tense meeting. Some wanted to sue. Others just looked tired. "We built this place," one older man said, voice cracking. "Now it's gone." "Maybe," another replied. "We were just borrowing it all along." Back at his cabin, Darnell received his first batch of permit applications. 10 of them. He filled out each approval by hand, added a note. Thank you for respecting the lake. He knew this wasn't the end. There would be more questions, more tension, maybe even more headlines. But for the first time in weeks, the water felt calm again, and that was enough, for now. The story didn't stay local for long. A local news segment about lake access rights got picked up by a regional outlet, then shared online with headlines like, "Man evicts entire fishing club, owns lake." Comments poured in. Some calling Darnell a hero standing up to entitled neighbors, others painting him as greedy, heartless, even using race to get his way. One post read, "If he really cared about the lake, he'd share it like a decent person." Darnell didn't read most of it. He'd learned years ago that the internet rarely tells the full story, but he couldn't ignore the real-world ripple. People he'd never met started showing up at the edge of his property, taking photos, pointing. A drone buzzed overhead one afternoon. He called the sheriff, who politely asked the operator to leave, but the message was clear. He was no longer just a quiet man on the lake. He was a symbol. And symbols get used. At first, Linda kept her distance, but the backlash hit her too. A neighbor stopped speaking to her at the mailbox. The HOA board quietly voted to rotate leadership, citing community healing. Even her closest friend gently said, "Maybe it's time to let someone else lead for a while." She didn't apologize, not out loud, not in writing, but she stopped organizing protests, stopped sending emails, and one Saturday morning just before dawn, she showed up at the dock with a small boy in a life vest, holding a beginner's fishing rod. Darnell was already there, mending a net. He didn't say anything, just nodded. The boy, barely tall enough to see over the dock railing, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are we allowed?" Darnell smiled. "As long as you're gentle with the fish." For an hour, the three of them sat in near silence. Linda didn't speak much. She watched her grandson cast his line, watched Darnell show him how to hold the rod without jerking, how to wait patiently. At one point, the boy caught a small sunfish. Darnell helped him unhook it, then held it in the water until it swam away. "Why'd we let it go?" the boy asked. "Because the lake gives us enough," Darnell said. "We don't have to take everything." Linda looked at him then, not with defiance, but something softer, like she was seeing him for the first time. Back in the neighborhood, things began to shift. Miguel, sensing an opening, proposed a town hall, not through the HOA, but as a community gathering at the old picnic pavilion near the lake's western edge. He invited Darnell, not as a defendant, but as a neighbor. Darnell almost said no. He didn't trust crowds, didn't like being put on display. But then he remembered his grandfather saying, "Truth don't need shouting, but it does need a voice." So he went. 20 people showed up, fewer than expected, but the right ones. Retirees, young parents, a couple of teenagers who just liked kayaking. No cameras, no signs. Just folding chairs and coolers of lemonade. Darnell stood in front of them, hands in his pockets, no notes. "I'm not here to take anything from you," he began, voice steady. "I'm here because my family never gave this land away. My granddaddy bought it when folks told him he couldn't. He kept it clean, kept it quiet, kept it whole. I'm just trying to do the same." He explained the permit system, not as a money grab, but as a way to limit traffic, protect fish, and fund cleanup. "The fees go straight back into the lake," he said. "New native plants, erosion control, water testing. If you care about this place, you're welcome to help, not just use it." A woman raised her hand. "What if we can't afford the fee?" "Then we'll figure something out," Darnell said. "Volunteer hours, helping with cleanups. This isn't about profit. It's about partnership." Afterward, people lingered. Some asked questions. Others just thanked him for coming. One man, who'd been part of the fishing club for 20 years, shook his hand. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I assumed. I'm sorry." That night, Darnell sat on his porch again, but the weight felt different, lighter, not because the problem was solved, but because the wall between us and them had cracked. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. A group of former fishing club members approached Miguel with an idea. What if they reformed not as a club with rights, but as a volunteer stewardship group? They'd help with trash pickup, monitor invasive species, even teach kids about conservation, all under Darnell's guidelines. Darnell listened. Then he agreed, but with one condition. They'd operate under a new name. No Silver Pine Fishing Club. Just Friends of Whitmore Lake. The first meeting was held at his cabin. 10 people showed up, boots muddy, hands calloused. They brought maps, water test kits, and a shared sense of purpose. Darnell made coffee. They talked for hours. Meanwhile, Linda kept bringing her grandson every other Saturday. She never asked for special treatment, never mentioned the HOA. She just showed up, watched, listened. One morning she brought a thermos of hot chocolate for everyone. Darnell noticed she'd started picking up trash along the path on her way in. He didn't comment, but he left an extra permit application on the dock with her name already written in pencil at the top. The online noise never fully died down, but in Silver Pine the real story was quieter and deeper. Kids signed up for the new Lake Explorers program Darnell started, learning about native plants, fish habitats, and why clean water matters. Local schools asked if they could bring classes for field trips. Even the bait shop owner switched to eco-friendly lures and started selling reusable water bottles with a simple logo, Whitmore Lake, respect it. One evening, as Darnell walked the shoreline checking for erosion, he found a small wooden sign someone had carved and stuck in the ground near the dock. Thank you for sharing your home. No name, just those words. He left it there. Back in town, the HOA quietly updated its covenants to include a footnote. Residents are reminded that portions of Silver Pine Lake remain privately owned. Always verify access rights before use. It wasn't an apology, but it was truth, and sometimes truth is enough to begin again. A year had passed since the sign first went up on the dock. The lake looked much the same shimmer at dawn, same herons stalking the shallows, but everything beneath the surface had changed. Darnell still rose before sunrise. Still rowed his old skiff across glassy water, but now sometimes he wasn't alone. On quiet mornings you might see a teenager in a kayak gliding near the reeds, binoculars around her neck, part of the new youth stewardship group. Or an older couple casting lines from the far bank, wearing bright orange Friends of Whitmore Lake vests. They always nodded when they saw him. Never intruded. Just shared the space, like guests who'd learned how to behave in someone else's home. The permit system had grown, but carefully. Only 50 were issued each season, enough to keep the lake healthy, not crowded. Most went to locals who showed up for cleanups or helped plant native grasses along the shore. The $25 fee hadn't changed, and every dollar went into a transparent account anyone could review. Last spring it funded a new aeration system that brought oxygen back to deeper waters. Fish returned in numbers no one had seen in years. The old fishing club was gone. In its place stood something quieter, more thoughtful. They met once a month in the pavilion, not to argue over rights, but to plan where to install nesting boxes for wood ducks, how to stop runoff from nearby driveways, whether to host a no-motor paddle day for families. They even invited Darnell to lead a session on reading water health, something his grandfather taught him using nothing but his eyes and a jar of lake water. He agreed. And for the first time, he stood in front of neighbors not as a threat but as a teacher. Linda rarely spoke at those meetings. She'd stepped down from the HOA completely and hadn't attended a single board meeting since, but she showed up to every stewardship event, usually with her grandson in tow. The boy, now 9, could identify 5 species of fish by sight and knew how to test pH levels with a strip of paper. He called Darnell Mr. Whitmore, but his eyes held the kind of trust usually reserved for uncles or coaches. One afternoon, Linda stayed behind after a cleanup. Darnell was coiling rope near the dock. "I never thanked you," she said, voice low. He looked up. "For what?" "For letting him keep coming. For not holding it against him." "Against us." Darnell wiped his hands on his jeans. "He didn't do anything wrong. And you showed up." "That counts," she nodded, eyes glistening but dry. "I thought I was protecting the community, but I was just protecting my own idea of it." He didn't offer empty comfort, just said, "We all get it wrong sometimes." She left a few minutes later, but not before picking up 2 plastic bottles someone had missed. That same week, Darnell got a call from the local elementary school. They wanted to start a field trip program focused on local ecology, and they asked if he'd be willing to host small groups at the lake. He hesitated. He wasn't a performer, didn't like being the center of attention, but then he thought of his grandfather, who used to let neighborhood kids help him plant trees just so they'd learn to care about the land. Yes, he said, but only if they come to learn, not just to look. The first group arrived on a cool Tuesday in early fall. 10 kids, ages 8 to 10, wide-eyed and buzzing with questions. Darnell didn't give a lecture. He handed each a small net and a clear container. "See what you can find," he said. "Then we'll talk about why it matters." They spent the morning turning over rocks, watching dragonfly nymphs dart through the shallows, sketching cattails in notebooks. One girl found a turtle and gasped like she'd discovered treasure. Darnell showed her how to hold it gently, how to tell its age by the rings on its shell. At the end, the teacher asked, "What's the most important thing you learned today?" The girl with the turtle didn't hesitate. "That the lake isn't just water. It's alive," Darnell smiled. That was enough. As the seasons turned, the story of the lake stopped being about ownership and started being about care. Tourists still drove by, snapping photos of the private lake, but locals knew better. They saw the clean shores, the thriving fish, the quiet respect that had replaced entitlement. Even the online chatter faded, replaced by posts from kids in the stewardship program showing off their water tests or photos of nesting ospreys. One evening, as summer gave way to autumn, Darnell sat on his porch with a cup of tea. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. From across the water, the soft splash of a paddle echoed, someone out late enjoying the calm. He thought about his grandfather often these days. Not with sadness, but with gratitude. Elijah Whitmore hadn't just left him land. He'd left him a responsibility and a chance to do it differently. The next morning, Darnell rowed out just as the sun broke the horizon. Mist rose off the water like breath. A loon called in the distance. He let the boat drift, oars resting, and just listened. No sirens, no arguments, no demands, just the lake breathing. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like home, not just his, but something shared carefully by those who'd learned to honor it. Later that day, he walked to the post office and dropped a letter in the box. It was addressed to the County Historical Society. Inside, he'd included copies of his grandfather's original deed, photos of the cabin being built in the 1950s, and a short note. This land has a story, not just about ownership, but about staying, about dignity, about what happens when you protect something long enough for others to learn to love it too. If you're interested, I'd be glad to share more. He didn't expect a reply, but it felt right to offer. Back at the dock that afternoon, he found a small envelope tucked under a rock, his usual spot for messages. Inside was a drawing from Linda's grandson, a boat, a lake, 2 figures fishing. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, "Thank you for teaching me how to listen to the water." Darnell pinned it to the wall inside his cabin, next to his grandfather's old fishing license. Life in Silverpine went on. Lawns were mowed, mail was delivered. Kids rode bikes down quiet streets. But something had shifted, not in the rules, but in the air. People looked at the lake differently now, not as a backdrop for their lives, but as a living thing that had been here long before them, and would remain long after. And Darnell? He kept rowing at dawn, not to prove anything, not to guard anything. Just because the water called and he knew how to answer. Some boundaries aren't meant to divide. They're meant to remind us what